Hi everyone, welcome to Rizzoli Bookstore. Thank you all so much for joining us here tonight. We're very excited to be here to celebrate the launch of Christiane Bird's new book, A Block in Time, a New York City history at the corner of 5th Avenue and 23rd Street. She tells the story of New York City from the age of exploration to the present through the history of a single block, which happens to be right in our very own backyard. She's the author of The Sultan's Shadow, 1,000 Sighs, 1,000 Revolts, and Neither Here Nor West. She's worked on the staff of the Daily News and has written for the Wall Street Journal, Washington Post, LA Times, and others. And tonight she will be in conversation with Bill Hayes, the author of How We Live Now and Insomniac City, among other books. He's received a Guggenheim Fellowship for Nonfiction and is a frequent contributor to the New York Times. So we're very lucky to have both of them here. After their conversation, we invite you to please join us for there's going to be an audience Q&A, and then we invite you to join us for a signing here at that table. We have books available for sale at the front of the bookstore at the register, which supports an independent bookstore in Manhattan. So thank you for supporting the store. Makes these events possible. So we just ask you to please keep your masks on during this event. And without further ado, please join me in welcoming Christiane Bird and Bill Hayes.
Thank you, Christina, and thank you everyone for coming tonight. It's really wonderful to have so many people come to hear me read from my book and talk to Bill. And it's also a special honor to be here since we're only 2 blocks north of the book that is the subject of the block that's the subject of my book. The block was the site of numerous scandals, and I thought I'd start by reading about one of them before getting into conversation with Bill. This excerpt comes from my chapter entitled Cracks in the Vault. During the last year of the Civil War, one Mrs. Electa Potter hung out a shingle at 386th Avenue, a small brick building on the west side of the block, much to the disgust and indignation of her neighbors. A tiny woman with bloated legs, recently recovered from a severe bout of rheumatism. She was a quote-unquote physician, code in her case for abortionist. Abortionists were easy to find in the mid-1800s. They advertised in the daily papers and handed out handbills. Sure cure for ladies in trouble, ran one ad. Monthly pills to remove obstructions, however produced, ran another. Experts estimated that the rate of abortions to live births in the city in the 1850s was a sky-high 1 to 5 or 6. As a bit player in a booming industry, Mrs. Potter and her abortion practice would have gone largely unnoticed were it not for her alleged involvement in a then even more controversial practice, divorce. Despite the liberal reputation today, New York has historically been ultra-conservative when it comes to marriage. It was the last state in the Union to pass a no-fault divorce law in 2010, and from 1787 to 1966, the only grounds for divorce in New York was adultery. Couples with money often went out of state to separate, to Indiana in the 1800s or Nevada in the 1900s, while other unhappy men and women tried to get out of their marriage by framing their spouse for adultery. Improbably, Mrs. Potter, an uneducated working-class abortionist in poor health, was named as the other woman in a scandalous celebrity divorce case involving Mary Stevens Strong and Peter Strong soon after her move to the block. Mary was a queen of society, the beautiful daughter of a wealthy, prominent banker. Peter was a well-known, well-connected lawyer. The couple had been apparently happily married for 7 years until Peter's brother Edward came to live with them in 1860. With Peter often out of the house on business and Edward always there during many lonely hours, Mary plunged into an affair with her brother-in-law. After it ended 2 years later, she felt full of remorse and confessed to her husband. They stopped living together. However, wishing to avoid publicity, he did not bring suit against her until 1865, 1985 when she took their youngest daughter to her parents' home and never returned. Mary's lawyers then countersued with the eye-popping claim that Peter had also strayed. He had had an adulterous relationship with Mrs. Potter while helping her run her abortion practice out of her former home at 124 Waverly Place, a building that he owned. The case took many months to come to trial and lasted 5 weeks. Dozens of witnesses, from family friends to private detectives, were called on to testify. No case before our court for many years has attracted greater attention, reported the New York Times. It was all but unheard of for members of high society to appear in court, and all but unheard of for the dirty secrets of the rich and powerful to be on full display before the public. High society lived in a sealed vault, a rarefied world beyond the ken of most, and seemed to have nothing in common with ordinary folk. Until, that is, cracks in the vault appeared. Today, the probable outcome of the trial seems obvious. Mary had confessed to and did not deny her adultery. Peter's case was rock solid. But at that time, things weren't that simple. Mary's lawyers argued that their client was deeply religious and physically frail, and had sinned only because of her husband's neglect and her brother-in-law's powers of persuasion, arguments that carried great weight in that era. Women were regarded as fragile and in need of protection, and even as Mary had quote-unquote dishonored her family and herself, Peter had been at fault for being away from home too much, not ensuring his wife's happiness, and failing to protect her from his brother, who was also at fault for not being strong enough to resist temptation. To avoid unseemly attention, Mary never appeared in court, but her powerful father was there daily. Behind his daughter 100%, he testified that Peter had been a cold, harsh husband. Mary's sister also testified, stating that Mary had suffered numerous miscarriages because of Peter's neglect. Mary's lawyers also brought forth various witnesses of questionable character. One swore that he had seen Peter enter 386th Avenue on numerous occasions, staying 1 to 1.5 hours each time. Another swore that she had once seen Peter in bed with Mrs. Potter, albeit with his clothes on, and assumed he was her husband. Next, the Stevens' lawyers came up with an even stranger allegation. They claimed that their client, believing she was having a miscarriage, had been advised by her husband to visit Mrs. Potter to ask for her help. The physician had then aborted a perfectly healthy child, the lawyers said, with the connivance of Peter, who was convinced the child wasn't his. In the end, the trial resulted in a hung jury. All the jurors found Mary guilty of adultery, but 2 believed that Peter had been guilty of adultery as well. Those 2 jurors were accused of having accepted bribes from Mary's family, a charge they vehemently denied. Soon thereafter, Peter was granted his divorce petition and given custody of the couple's children, and Mary returned to her parents' home. Mrs. Potter moved off the 23rd Street block, but where she went immediately afterward is unclear. Her name and that of her husband Vernon, a fruit vendor, disappeared from the New York City directory for 3 years. In 1868, however, a Vernon Potter was listed as working in produce on Vesey Street and living in New Jersey.
Congratulations.
Well, thank you, Bill. Thank you for being here to be in conversation with me.
Of course, I loved the book. I thought of the book as a kind of literary archaeology, where you were sifting through layer after layer of history, uncovering it of this single block. So starting with the story you told, how did you uncover this story and tell it so well?
Well, you know, a lot of it was chance, and the first thing I did, I'd already done a lot of research on the Tenderloin district, which was a sex and entertainment district that encompassed the block that I write about. So I already was well versed in that history. And when I decided to trace the history of the block from its very beginnings, my first stop was the municipal archives, where I could look up and see who had lived on what block
during the very early years of the city's founding. And then from there, I did a lot of research in newspaper archives, and I would search addresses on the block, and names came up. That's how Mrs. Potter's name came up. When I put in every single address on the block, and some of them produced names. Most of them didn't actually, but some of them did. And then I looked in all the archives I could find to get the full history of her.
I was so surprised by the history about doctors performing abortions and that it was sort of accepted.
It was sort of accepted. It was technically speaking against the law, but the law was mostly put in place to prevent women from going to quacks. It was mostly for women's health. So a lot of people looked the other way when women went to abortionists. It was a controversial practice, no doubt about that, but it wasn't, people looked the other way a lot.
You say in the book that the idea for it came to you 25 years ago, the germ for the idea of the book.
Yes.
So, where were you 25 years
Yes.
ago? What was the idea? Did it come as a lightning strike?
I was getting my master's thesis at Columbia and taking some courses on New York City history with Kenneth Jackson, who was a marvelous lecturer. And I was in his urban history class and decided to write my master's thesis on the Tenderloin. And I was entranced by this place. That it was the center of all this illicit activity. There were saloons and brothels and illicit boarding houses and concert halls and all of the sort of underground activity happening right next door to magnificent luxury hotels, wonderful theaters, restaurants, and it was that mix of high life and low life, the rich and the poor, hope and fame and all the sort of bright side of life on the one hand, and then the dark side of life on the other, the poverty and the degradation, and I was very intrigued by that. So I never forgot about that idea, but I couldn't figure out how to put it together into a coherent narrative. So I went on and I wrote other books, I had other jobs, I had kids, life just kept going on, but I never forgot about it. And I was in conversation with my friend and editor, Nancy Miller, who's here tonight, and we formulated this idea of writing a book that would just concentrate on one block.
What were the borders of the Tenderloin at that time?
Initially, it was between 5th and 7th Avenues, 23rd and 34th Street. That's where it started a few years after the Civil War. But then as the decades went by, it spread north to 42nd and then up as far as 55th Street and west as far as 8th Avenue.
So you said you sort of dropped the idea for the book, or was it in the back of your mind as you wrote other books and life carried on? What brought you back to the book?
The books I had written before this had to do with the Middle East, and I did a fair amount of travel in the Middle East, and then I had kids, and that wasn't so easy to do anymore, so it brought me back to thinking about New York. What could I do while I was more sedentary, more stationary?
But of all the blocks in New York City, how did you pick this one? I just walked around it before our conversation.
Right. Well, first of all, it was on the edge of the Tenderloin, but it had been the site of the Fifth Avenue Hotel, which was this amazing center of political, cultural, and social life in the second half of the 1800s. There were a lot of famous people that stayed there. It was the state headquarters for the Republican Party. A lot of funds were raised there for the Union Army during the Civil War. And it just had a lot of history to it. And at the same time, so I knew the bright side of life, the fame and the money was all there on the Fifth Avenue side. But I knew that on the Sixth Avenue side was where all the brothels and the saloons were. And so I thought this would make a really good juxtaposition showing the Fifth Avenue side and I was very lucky. There was a lot going on in that block that I wasn't aware of when I started.
So did you start doing, sort of digging into the research of that particular hotel, the Fifth Avenue
Yes,
Hotel,
I did.
and kind of spread out from there?
I started there, and I started with the names of the people that I found living Hotel. Because actually the Fifth Avenue Hotel, I didn't find as much history about it as I thought I would, but I discovered all sorts of things, like the fact that Edwin Booth, the famous actor, had lived at the hotel and lived somewhere else on the block for a while. Stanford White, the famous architect, he had his love nest on the 24th Street side of the block. That was where the red velvet swing was, if any of you are probably familiar with that story, where he seduced numerous underage young women, most notably Evelyn Nesbit, who went on to marry Harry Thaw, who then killed Stanford White in Madison Square Garden that was in Madison Square Park. So there were a lot of characters.
So you've done a lot of travel writing over your
Yes.
career. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Well,
Where it took you in the world?
it took me to, first it took me to Iran. My dad had been a medical doctor in Iran when I was growing up. Some of the first year, my memories are of Iran, so I'd always wanted to go there. And I was fortunate because this was quite some time ago now, but in 1998, the country had opened up because the moderate president, Khatami, had come to power. And I was able to travel back and see the hospital where my dad had worked and meet some of the people that he knew. So from there, I segued into writing about the Kurdish people. I wrote a book about the Kurds the year before the Iraq War began. And then I went on to write a book about the east coast of Africa and the slave trade and the family of sultans that had dominated that.
Wow.
It's a range.
It's amazing. Now this book requires a sort of time travel, right? Because you go from, what, 12,000 years ago with Native Americans in Manhattan, through the centuries, up through to the pandemic. Maybe you can talk about sort of the range of the history in the book.
Yeah, well, one thing I really do want to talk about especially is the first owner of the block, who was a freed slave, which seems astonishing to me. It was his father was one of the first 11 slaves brought over to the colony in 1626, the same year that Peter Minuet arrived. And after this first group of slaves had worked for the West India Company for 18 years, they went in front of the Director General and they said, "We've served for 18 years, that's long enough, we want our freedom, we have to take care of our families now." Surprising that anyone would make that kind of request to our minds, right? But then the Director General, even more surprisingly, granted their request. He gave them what was called half freedom. They had to provide a certain amount of crops and livestock to the West India Company every year, and also assist in times of emergency, but otherwise they were pretty much free. So then his son was also granted half freedom, and when Peter Stuyvesant was Director General and the British appeared in the harbor, his son, Solomon Peters, and another group of about 8 slaves went in front of Peter Stuyvesant, and they said, "We're only half free. What are the British going to think of this? You know, they're not going to know if we're slaves or not slaves." And Stuyvesant was the man who first encouraged slave ships to come to New York. The slave trade increased exponentially under his rule, and yet he was also a person of contradictions, because he listened to them and he said, "Okay, you know, you're free." And this man, Solomon Peters, went to work for one of the British generals and ended up being granted 30 acres of upland, which spread from 21st to 26th Street, Broadway to between 6th and 7th Avenue. And his family owned it for about 30 years.
How did you conduct your research? This is a deeply researched book covering several centuries, many decades. How, where?
You know, I was extremely fortunate. Extremely fortunate. First of all, at the New York Historical Society, I found a manuscript that dealt with this African-American family, the Pietrus family, and traced their history. Then I also found another document that spoke about the early history of a Dutch family that owned the block after the African-American family. addition to that, tons of things are available on the internet archives these days. I mean, if I had written this book 25 years ago when I first vaguely thought of it, it would have taken years and years and years and many hours of research in the libraries. And now I found so many contemporary documents online. It's astonishing.
There's a quote in the book I liked where you say, at times the block has seemed to embody all that is best in human nature, and at other times it has seemed to embody all that is worst. And I wonder if you can talk about that and maybe give us some examples or stories.
Well, there were a lot of con men and a lot of prostitutes associated with the block, and there were also people, high society people, and people of great talent living on the block. One very interesting character that, in a way, encompasses both of those aspects of the city was a woman named Marietta Stevens, who was the wife of the manager of the Fifth Avenue Hotel. And she was born into a bourgeois household and came to New York and as the husband of, as the wife of a much older man. And she was determined to break into old New York society. This was during the Gilded Age. But they wouldn't have anything to do with her. You know, she was an upstart, they was an Arabiste, it was new money. But she persevered, and she was in some ways, I think, probably not a nice woman. She was very egotistical, very opinionated, loud and brash. She was also a breath of fresh air. She brought in, she knew what she wanted, she refused to sit on the sidelines, and she wormed her way into old New York society, partly by doing a lot of very intelligent things. She became very friendly with the Prince of Wales. He had stayed in the hotel for just 3 weeks, but he managed, she managed to become good friends with him. She managed to have her daughter meet one of his friends, and the Prince of Wales attended her daughter's wedding. Her son, Harry, was briefly engaged to the future Edith Wharton. So she was a woman who really knew her way, really knew how to get what she wanted. As a matter of fact, maybe I'll just read a short, because she also, upon her death, all the New York papers ran her obituary, and I just want to read this short thing here. The Harper's Weekly called her a remarkable female, a very notable woman who not only got what she wanted, but she had an abundance of fun with it after she made it hers. She had great courage, great energy, great force. She was very tough, very game, very able, very enterprising, exceedingly interesting, and they say impulsive, generous, and kind. New York has lost its most brilliant ornament.
Amazing. How did the block change in terms of class differences over the centuries and decades?
One of the most interesting things about the block in the second half of the 1800s was that you had all classes, all types of people living there. But a lot of the residential buildings were torn down around the turn of the century, and they were replaced by office and loft buildings. So suddenly the amazing population and changes that had been occurring regularly on the block no longer were, because it was all businesses. So that's when the block did a very different shift, total different shift. And for a while it was the center of shirtwaist factories, wholesale China stores. There was a shopping center for a while. It was also the home of kind of a wax museum. So it went through a big shift. And one of the really surprising things for me about writing this book was how quickly things changed. I mean, I thought, okay, every generation things change. But it really wasn't every generation, it was really every 10 years. In the 1880s, the block was in the middle of nowhere, as far as most people were concerned. Then the 1860s, it was highly fashionable. Everyone wanted to live there. Extremely wealthy families lived there. Already by the mid-1870s, the 24th Street side of the block, which had been a site for many very beautiful brownstones where people wealthy families wanted to live. All of a sudden, it was going downhill already. Some of them were turning into illicit boarding houses. In the matter of 15 years, you know, and it was very surprising to see how quickly things changed. And I feel like I've experienced that even in my own lifetime, because I remember in the 1980s when Madison Square Park was filled with many homeless people. If you walked there at night, you'd see people in boxes sleeping along the edge of the park. The block itself was dark. There was nothing lit. And now look at it. It's
So beautiful now.
yeah.
Isn't that so true though of New York City in general?
Yeah.
All these different layers of different centuries and decades. Like you can look out your window and see a building from the 19th century, early 20th century, 1970s, and so forth. I love that about New York, don't you?
Yeah, I love that too. And you know, one thing I was thinking about Bill's wonderful book, Insomniac City, where he talks about a lot of people he encounters on the street of New York. And I was thinking about how his and my books are similar because they're both about people in New York, but how the people that he talks about probably won't be appearing in a book 100 years from now, because the people I'm talking about are people that somehow or another, even if they're ordinary people, got their names in the paper or into some sort of history. And these are the sorts of stories that are lost. And also, when I was researching my book, I thought, I just have a handful of stories here. There were thousands of people who lived on the block. Who knows what their stories were? Who knows what they contributed? It's mind-boggling to think of all the different lives and the maybe very important stories, maybe even more interesting stories than the ones that I write about, but they're lost, you know, you don't know where they can't find them, you know.
I'm really curious about the different kind of personalities of 23rd versus 24th. Are they like two sides of the same coin?
Yeah.
Do they sometimes seem like they're miles apart, or?
That to me was one of the fascinating things about the book, because as I said, what had drawn me to the idea in the first place was the juxtaposition of the high life and the low life, the rich and the poor, and that was so much made manifest by the two sides of the block. You had the Fifth Avenue side all about commerce and wealth and glamour and glitter, and then the Sixth Avenue side was the opposite. And interestingly enough, there was another hotel on the Sixth Avenue side of the block, the St. Omar's Hotel, Omar's Hotel, where there was a couple of cases of women being murdered there, and a young girl who had gone missing, who'd been seduced there by an older man. And then even up to present day, when they were having welfare hotels to house some of the homeless families back in the 1980s, the St. Omar's was one of the welfare hotels for a while. Currently, the Sixth Avenue side of the block is almost empty. You just have the Masonic Temple on the south corner. But the Freemasons of New York now own the entire block, and the half of the block is now a parking lot, which, interestingly enough, during the pandemic, that area, the corner of 6th Avenue and 24th Street, became a center for homeless people. And I felt when I was writing the book that the ghosts of the past are still lingering, because it's like the 6th Avenue side can't escape its past. It's many sad stories there. And the 5th Avenue side continues to be, you know, Italy is there now, Lego, and all of those things that we know about.
So this is maybe a hard question to answer, but did you have a favorite side? 23rd versus 24th? Or 5th versus 6th?
I was a
I want to
little
put you on the
bit,
spot.
I have to, no, not really, because it was the 6th Avenue side, and the elements of the 6th Avenue side that traveled over to the 5th Avenue side, of which there were quite a few, were actually the most fascinating to me.
We think of New York as such a melting pot, so diverse, all different communities. Is that also true of this one single block of New York?
Well, it was in the 1800s. I mean, not so much now. It seems disappointing in a way to be on that block now, because it seems so much more homogenous in my mind to what it must have been like in the late 1800s. You know, I think about one aspect of diversity there is that there are lots of different kinds of companies working in different floors and stuff, but, there's always a romance to the past too, you know,
Mhm.
there doesn't seem to have quite the magic to me that I felt when I was reading about the past. But maybe it's hidden there somewhere.
One thing that I found so interesting is you said it was difficult to find information or research or stories before the 18th century, I think you said.
Right.
But then I was surprised you said it was also difficult to find really good, interesting, captivating stories about the more recent decades.
That was true because so many of the residential buildings were gone and they were all office and loft buildings. And so it was hard to find interesting, you know, juicy kinds of stories about offices for the most part.
Oh, really?
As a matter of fact, it was kind of a sad moment in the book for me when, you know, around the time of World War I, New York was on the rise. I mean, the building was happening all over the city. There was the Harlem Renaissance was going on, and there was Prohibition, and all these speakeasies operating all over town. It was really a high point in New York City history, but not on the block. The block had been sort of forgotten by that point. It was just a place to pass through on the way to somewhere else. Its hotels were gone, its restaurants were gone, its theaters were gone. It had been forgotten about really at that point.
What would you say was the block at its height? Height of activity?
Well, that would really be the second half of the 1800s, maybe 1880s, something like that, when the Fifth Avenue Hotel was at its zenith, and there were so many different people staying there, and that would really be the top point.
And then the flip side of that, you say it reached its nadir in the 1970s and 80s with the financial crisis and
financial crisis.
homelessness and crime. And for me, a very interesting chapter, because I'm a photographer as well as a writer, is the chapter about Robert Maplethorpe,
Yes.
who had a loft on 23rd Street side,
He did,
right?
at 35 West 23rd Street. He lived the last years of his life there before dying of AIDS in 1989. And he was not the first photographer connected with that area. There were earlier photographers who had studios around Madison Square Block, Madison Square Park, and then Baldef Dugal had a big photo processing plant or business in the teens somewhere, but then he moved his big store onto 23rd Street. I think that was the 1990s or something. So there's been a long photographic history connected with the block.
And am I correct that Sam Wagstaff bought the loft
Yes,
from
he did.
Maplethorpe?
Yes.
And is this where Maplethorpe created so many of his iconic photos and controversial
Well,
photos?
at least some of them. I don't know. He lived somewhere else. He'd had other studios before
see.
then. So, yeah. I think some of the iconic ones were created elsewhere.
So speaking of photos, I think you have a few
I would like to
images.
show a few images from after the African American family owned the block. A Dutch family owned it for 100 years. They built a farmstead in what was now the middle of Fifth Avenue, just below 23rd Street. And when the Fifth Avenue was laid out, the grid plan was laid out here in New York, they were forced to move that house. It could no longer stand in the middle of Fifth Avenue. So they moved it to the corner of the 23rd Street block, and they sold it to a man who opened up a stagecoach stop, basically. And stagecoaches left from here every 4 minutes for downtown. And it was also a tavern. There were a lot of rules, like only 8 people to a bed and no boots on the bed. So
8 people to put that.
something like that. It was a huge amount. They also had horse races leading from here, going all the way uptown. It used to attract a lot of turfmen who would come to race their wagons here. And then after that, the next, let's see. Okay, after the the demise of that cottage, something called Franconi's Hippodrome was built here. It was a center for ostrich races and camel races and many different kinds of wild animals appeared here. There were elephants and giraffes and all that sort of thing, but it only was around for about 2 years. It had a lot of problems. There was a lot of controversy about it in various ways. And so after 2 years, it was replaced by, let's see if I can, oh yeah, here we go, whoops. Oh, that's the wrong way. I seem to be doing this wrong. And it's like, sorry. This was the Fifth Avenue Hotel when it was first constructed. There it is right there. And it was built by a man named Amos Eno. And at the time, it was considered very foolhardy of him to put this luxurious hotel out in the middle of nowhere. In fact, people called it Eno's Folly. But given the rate of change here in New York, it was only 3 years. It took 3 years to be constructed. And by the time it was finished, New York had moved up to Madison Square. So it was a near overnight success. And it was such a success that close to a dozen other luxury hotels soon opened in the area. Then the theaters moved up, prostitutes moved up, low life.
Prostitutes keep coming up in this conversation.
Anyway, that was Amos Eno. He was a New Englander who came here having very little money in his pocket and became a billionaire. And the Fifth Avenue Hotel was also known for its stock trading. There was a lot of activity, especially around the time of the Civil War, and there weren't enough hours in the day to do all the trading that people wanted to do. So they would come to the Fifth Avenue Hotel, and for a time there was something called the Gallagher's Exchange on the 24th Street side of the block, and that was the picture here.
Where did you find all these great images?
Many of them come from the New York Public Library. It's just a vast. The St. Omer's Hotel, which I mentioned earlier, was in the beginning, before it had become a more disreputable place, was a place where a lot of athletes would stay when they came to town. And one of the best known was this man named Frank Hart. He was a champion of pedestrianism, which was racing around a track for 4 or 5 days at a time. And he earned a lot of money. One of his races, he broke a world record, and he earned what would be the equivalent of half $500,000 today. He was racing at the Madison Square Garden, second Madison Square Garden built in Madison Square Park.
You know, I just finished the book, which came out in January, about the history of exercise, called Sweat. But I didn't know about pedestrianism.
You should have that in your book.
To add that, Nancy.
And then this is one of the theaters that was on the block. It was in operation for quite a few decades. And this is...
That's so beautiful.
Yeah, it's such a beautiful picture. That's Evelyn Nesbit, the young actress that Stanford White seduced in his love nest on the rock. And then this is a wide-angle view of Madison Square. You can see the Fifth Avenue Hotel on the block down in the near the center, near the Flatiron building.
Fantastic.
A lot of wonderful images of the block in that period.
What were some of the greatest challenges in putting together this book, which reads so smoothly as a narrative, but is interweaving so many stories?
It was very hard.
I hear ya. Feel
I
ya.
almost gave up a few times, I have to admit. It was just, there was so much material and so much overlapping. You know, I couldn't,
you think before writing, okay, I'll write in chronological order, but it didn't really work that way because if you're writing about a person, their life extends over a lot of years, and so then you'd have to kind of get to the end of what was interesting about them, but then all of a sudden that was 50 years ahead of where you wanted to be. So it was very tricky figuring out how to do that. And actually in the beginning I wasn't even sure how I was going to structure it. I didn't even know that I wanted to focus on people. I just had this idea about the block, so first I thought maybe major events, and that just didn't work, and I wasn't that interested when I started thinking of it that way. It was when I settled on just writing about people that it really came together for me. Another very hard part was writing about the modern era because there was so much about the 1800s, and then when it turned into an office and loft location, it was just harder. It was harder to find interesting stories. I could write more dry narrative, but not something that was captivating.
So tell us about the block now. I took a walk around it before this conversation.
Well, like everything else, the block was been greatly affected by the pandemic.
Yeah.
You know, everyone working at home, all the offices were closed, some of the businesses closed, there was a restaurant. One of the oldest buildings on the block is this wonderful arts and crafts building on the 24th Street side. There was a restaurant in there that closed during the pandemic. And things operated at half speed for a long time. But I think the block now really is dominated still by its Fifth Avenue side, by Italy, by Legos, by the many companies, big companies that have offices in that 200 Fifth Avenue, which is built in the same sort of shape as the old Fifth Avenue Hotel.
So if you ever had days when you got stuck or frustrated, did you kind of just walk around the block and just try to hope stories would ease out of the buildings?
I would try to find that sort of old mystery that I felt was there before that I feel is hard to find now. I don't feel that when I walk around the block, except sometimes when I'm on the 6th Avenue side and it's late and the parking lot is deserted and you feel some of the ghosts of the old New York there. I would try to find inspiration, but I found more inspiration in the historical material because that's when things really came alive and it felt all the romance of the era came to life for me.
It's wonderful. We have such a wonderful big crowd, and I bet there are lots of questions. Shall we see if there's some questions?
If you have a question, just raise your hand.
Just raise your
We
hand.
can bring you a mic.
So how long was the Fifth Avenue Hotel open? Because someone just asked me about it over the weekend, and I'd never heard of it, and now here I am listening to you.
It was there for about 50 years, actually exactly 50 years. It opened in 1859 and it closed in 1909, yes.
In the 1950s or
No,
something?
1909, it was already done, it was all out.
And did it go somewhere else then? Was there
Well,
another
there
one?
is a Fifth Avenue hotel now, but it has no relationship.
Has no relationship
No.
to this one. Is the building still there?
Well, now it's 200 Fifth Avenue, and the building is basically, covers the same area and is built in some of the same shape. Like there's an interior courtyard area that's similar to what used to be there when the Fifth Avenue Hotel was there.
Did you run into any difficulty when you were researching about the Masonic, because they're very secretive?
Well, you know, they're much less secretive than they used to be.
I was just wondering if you ran into any difficulty researching the Masonic Society, because they're quite secretive or used to
Well,
be?
they're actually much less secretive than they used to be, because their numbers have dwindled precipitously. They're really, I don't remember what they are, but they're a much smaller organization than they used to be. So now they actually offer free tours every day. If anybody's interested in touring, and there's a lot of things they don't tell you, like why they have these certain symbols and that kind of thing. But I didn't do a deep dive into what all their ceremonies are about or anything. But they do give you a general information about who they are.
Following up to that one, did you say the Freemasons own the entire block?
No, the 6th Avenue side.
On the 6th Avenue from 6th to 5th on the north side? Or-
On the west side. Do you know where the?
I know where the Freemason building is. I was just wondering how much they owned of that.
Yeah, well, they have the one building on the corner of 23rd
And 6th.
And 6th,
Yeah.
right? And then on 24th Street, they have another building that's connected to that building in the back.
Okay.
And then between those two buildings, there's a big empty parking lot. That's what they own.
Gotcha. And the other thing is, Flatiron is outside the realm, the
It
scope
is.
of this.
It is outside, yeah.
Okay. Just right outside.
Did you have a favorite building that you discovered that you sort of fell in love with? Like,
Yeah.
that's my favorite building for this whole project.
You know, a lot of the historic buildings aren't there anymore. I do have, just because it's so beautiful, the arts and crafts, the building that I mentioned before is a favorite. The 5th Avenue Hotel obviously is no longer there, but that is a favorite building in my mind. And Stanford White's Love Nest is now being replaced by the condominiums that have gone. There's a new building going up on the block, first in many decades. I think it's still under construction. It was near completion when the pandemic started, so I don't know what its status is right now, but it's a condo that stretches all the way through the block, and it replaced Stanford White's Love Nest, and also the FAO Schwartz had one of its stores on the block.
I know this is further west, but did you do any research on the Chelsea Hotel?
Not really, no. I talk about it a little bit when I talk about Robert Maplethorpe, just how he has a long connection with 23rd Street because of being in the Chelsea Hotel with Patti Smith. And I do talk about it a little bit because I felt like it had a connection with the 6th Avenue side of the block, because in addition to all its famous actors and writers and musicians, it also was a place that was frequented by prostitutes and other. So there was a connection, but it's not something I did a lot of research on. Okay, great. Well, thank you, everybody. Thank you so much.
Please join me in thanking We're going to have books for sale at the register, both a book of bills as well as this book. So please get your book up there and then come join us here in the signing line. Your purchase supports an independent bookstore in Manhattan. So thank you all very much for coming out tonight. Have a lovely night.
It's a memoir about my life in New York City. And I bought a camera when I moved here, and just began taking photographs of people on the street. So that's also how I just encountered people and stories. So yeah, it's just sad.
I'm going to finish it soon. I love it. Really, life has treated you well, so take care.
We have to catch up. I
Yes,
can't wait.
I know, take care. That was really great, what a good idea. Thank you.
Oh, well, I've been missing. And this is, did you remember today? I feel like maybe, I can't remember. I've heard the writer, answer, yeah. Thank you for coming. I'll tell you, I really miss a lot of that old stuff. I feel like right now, why did they have to tear everything down? Exactly. It's not everything, but it's hard to talk about it, but it's just so much. You know, that's especially it's like,
you did great.
Don't you think so?
Yeah, it was very great.
I can't wait to get the whole thing ready.
And nice selection.
It's an amazing block, it really is, and I was lucky because I don't think all the blocks would have that many stories connected with it. Yeah. So, Sherry, thank you for coming. That's so nice. Thank you. We got lost, but I appreciate it. Thank you. I am signing. I think I'm going to sit down and sign.
It's so great to see you.
It's great for you to come.
Get together again
We
really
have to
soon.
soon.
Yeah, even just a walk or whatever. Okay.
Okay.
Insomniac City. You made it to it's with Brouhaha Entertainment and
I had to look it up. Thank you for coming. Thank you, Debbie. I felt like I was stumbling.
I'm gonna pin him down.
Oh, but if you don't want to wait, I'll do it when we see each other. Thank you.
Love you. I can't hold it now.
What's your feet? What's your
Thank you.
Yes,
yeah, it is.
Yeah, well, let's see how long the line is.